Hi, I'm Jane from Poppy Patchwork, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to make a 9-inch block called Mrs. Brown's Choice. You can use this quilt block to make a quilt, and here are 3 different options. The first one is the quilt block repeated. The second one is the same quilt block but with sashings and cornerstones, and the third option is the quilt block placed on point. So I've drawn the block out in my quilt block notebook so that I can work out what size to cut the pieces. So this block is made up of corner square units and cat's cradle units. And so for this you're going to need 4 2¼ by 3¼ rectangles in background fabric and 16 2-inch squares. In fabric A you're going to need 4 2¼ inch squares. In fabric B you're going to need 2 4 by 5-inch rectangles and 4 2-inch squares. And in fabric C you're going to need 5 3½-inch squares. So we're going to start by making the corner square units, and for this we're going to need the 5 3½-inch squares and the 16 2-inch squares and the 4 2-inch squares. I'm going to put the other pieces to one side. Now for the corner square units we're going to need to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of all the small squares. Now I'm going to pin white squares in the corners of my larger square. Now 4 of my larger squares will need the small white squares pinning in the corners, and the 5th large square will need the red fabric pinning in the corner. So when I pin these in the corner, the drawn line needs to run from here to here, and then I'm going to pin another small square in the opposite corner with the drawn line running in the same direction from here to here. So when you're doing this, it's really important to get the corners here, the edges, matched up really neatly. Now remember, for the 5th piece you need your other fabrics to go in the corner. So I'm going to take these to the sewing machine and sew on top of the drawn line. So I'm going to remove the pins and then I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch away from the sewn line. So to do this, I'm going to lay the 1/4 inch line of the ruler on top of the stitching, and then I'm going to cut along the right hand side. So I'm now going to set the seams and then press towards the small triangles. So I'm going to set the seams and press towards the small triangles. So the pieces now look like this, and we're going to place another little square in the corner, and the line needs to run across like this. And I'm going to repeat that in the other corner. So I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and sew on top of the drawn line. So I'm now going to remove the pins. I'm now going to cut 1/4 inch away from the sewn line by placing the 1/4 inch line of the ruler on top of the stitched line and cutting. And now I'm going to press the seams. So I'm going to set the seam and then press towards the triangles. And now I'm going to place these to one side. Now we're going to make the cat's cradle units. And for this, I'm going to use the Cat's Cradle tool designed by Deb Heatherly for Creative Grids. So for this, you're going to need squares, small rectangles and large rectangles like we cut. I'm just going to put the large rectangles to one side, and we're working with the small rectangles and the squares. And what we want to do is sew the squares and the rectangles together along the short edge. So I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I've sewn those together and now we need to press. Now when making the cat's cradle, we always press towards the square. Now we need to join these together in pairs. So it's like making a 4 patch, except we're not joining the seams together, they're offset. I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And now we're going to press those seams. Now, like I said before, we need to press towards the square, which means these seams will need to be pressed in opposite directions. So to do this, I'm just going to fold it in half. The seam is running along here. And now I'm just going to snip down to the seam. And now when I lay this down, I'm able to press towards the square, away from. When I lay this down, I'm able to press away from the squares. So the seam's running along here. I'm going to fold it in half. I'm then going to snip to the seam. And now I'm going to press these seams in opposite directions. So I'm first going to set the seam, and now I'm going to press this one away and this one away from the square. I'm going to repeat on this one. So now we're going to use the ruler, and I'm working with the wrong side up, and on the ruler there is a solid line here that says we need to place this on the seam. So this is the seam of the corner piece. So I've laid that on the seam there. And I want to make sure that when I sew, I'm going to mark my sewing line, and when I sew I want to make sure that I'm going to be sewing across the point. So I might just move the line a tiny little bit away so that when I'm marking this I can mark it on the point. And now I'm going to rotate that round and repeat. And I'm going to do that with the other piece as well. And now I'm going to get the large rectangles and placing these right sides together, I'm going to pin in place. And when I take these to the sewing machine, I'm going to sew on top of the drawn line. I'm going to remove the pins. Now I'm just going to flip it back to see if I'm happy with those points. So I'm happy with that point, but this point isn't great, so I might redo that one. I'm happy with that point, and I'm also happy with that point. So I'm just going to redo this one and I'll rejoin you when I've done that. Okay, so that is better now. I'd lined the wrong seam lines up. So now that I'm happy with those, you need to trim the seams. So I'm going to line the 1/4 inch line on the ruler on top of the sewn line, and then we're going to cut away, and you're going to be cutting in between these two sewn lines. I'm going to rotate this piece round and repeat. Now, as you can see, you're cutting away just a very, very small slither, so if you wanted to just cut down the centre, you could. And so now we're going to set the seams and press the seams. So set the seams, and then we're going to press towards the large triangle. So now these need to be trimmed. If you're using the tool, you're going to be trimming to 3 inches, which is the finished block size. So the markings on the ruler are for the finished block size. But if you're not using this ruler, you need to trim your piece to 3.5 by 3.5, which will give you your seam allowance. So using this ruler, as I said, I'm lining up my 3 inches using the trim to size markings on the ruler. So you line the square up, which is shown as a triangle here. I'm just going to rotate that a bit. So you're lining the square up here, and this dotted line here should line up on your seam. So I'm getting the best fit there. And once I've done that, I'm going to trim up one side and along the top. And now we need to rotate that around, and then you line the 3 inch line along your seam line, and you make sure that this line here is going through the corner over here, and then you trim up and down. Okay, so I'll demonstrate how you use this tool. so to use this tool, you line your 3-inch line on the ruler along the square here, and then the dotted line needs to run along the stitched line, and then you're going to trim up one side and down the other side. Then you're going to rotate this piece around, and now you're going to line that 3-inch line along your stitch line here, and then this dotted line here needs to go through the corner of your block, and then you're going to trim up one side and down the other side. I'll do the others like that. So I've laid it out in the block layout, and now I'm going to sew them together in columns. For this piece here, you're going to need to make sure that the points line up. If you right mouse click on the link above, it will take you to my video on how to get perfect points. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to set the seams and press the seams open. So returning the pieces to the block layout, we're now ready to sew the bottom pieces onto the columns. So I'm going to take these to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to set the seams and press them open. Now I'm going to return these to the block layout. And now we can sew the columns together. again matching the seams using the positioning point technique. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine and sew with the 1/4 inch seam. Then we're going to press those seams open. So I'm not very happy with that point there, so I'm going to unpick it and make it better, and I'll come back when I've done that. So I fixed that, I'm a bit happier with it now, so I can sew the final seam of this block. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine for the final seam. So I'm going to set the seam and press it open. Congratulations! You have made the 9-inch block Mrs. Brown's Choice.